Phil, let's jump straight in. I mean, thanks for joining us on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. I got the opportunity.
Thanks for inviting me.
No worries. I had the opportunity to sit in front of you the other week at the European Endurance Conference, and absolutely, well, personally, selfishly, or whatever you want to call it, I was my favourite lecture of the weekend, just in terms of it resonated very strongly with me, and I think I put my hand up about 3 or 4 times with questions. But yeah, I'm looking forward to just having a chat with you. But would you mind just explaining your background and the research and everything that you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an exercise physiologist at Northumbria University. I've been there for 30 plus years. Did my PhD there. My PhD was on factors influencing running performance. My early research, the very first couple of studies, there was a study done by Veronique Bielow's group. If you come across her, she's done loads of research on running, a group from Paris, and they came up with this idea of a knee flexor fatigue hypothesis in running. So they had people run to exhaustion at the speed at VO2 max, so the kind of the max aerobic speed, if you like. And they found changes in running gait, and they hypothesized that was due to essentially the knee flexors fatiguing. So the knee flexors being the hamstring muscles, for those that aren't familiar with that. And so that part of the gait where your leg swings forward in the stride, the hamstrings are being continually stretched, and they thought that the fatigue in that was part of what was then causing the subsequent change in mechanics. And they hypothesized that was due to a lack of strength. So the first study that I ever did, or the first published research I ever did, we looked at that and we did exactly what they had done, but we also took measurements of strength. So we did an eccentric action on an isokinetic machine. So we measured eccentric strength of the hamstrings, but we did an endurance test rather than a max strength test, because we felt that the repeated efforts really, or the repeated stretching, that might be the problem. So we wanted to look at that kind of strength endurance, if you like. And we found strong, reasonably high correlations between the performance on the endurance task and the changes in gait. So the people that had the best endurance performance on the isokinetic task showed the smallest change in running style. So that was the first study. And then from there, we went on to look at changes in running economy and how that was related to strength, because there's quite a bit of evidence showing that over a long distance, running economy changes from the beginning to the end. Rather than have people do a really long run, we did a 10-minute run and we measured running economy at the end of that. And then we went straight into 4 minutes of running again at the max aerobic speed. And then we dropped back to a 10-minute run and we measured running economy at the end of that 10 minutes. So the idea of the 4-minute block was really just to fatigue people, but not exhaust people, if you like. And we found that running economy did drop. And again, that change was related to the eccentric endurance of the hamstrings. So that kind of fitted with that earlier work. So that kind of early stuff was I guess, it's fatigue resistance as we call it now, but people weren't talking about it quite in the way then that they were. And then more recently, I've had a PhD student, Shaveen Riazati. He's now graduated and gone back to the States. And we were looking at fatigue. So if you're going to understand fatigue resistance, you kind of have to understand fatigue as well. And we were looking more at training rather than maximal efforts. So we did a couple of studies, and one of them we did 6 800s, 1 kilometer per hour below the max aerobic speed. So sort of a typical session that maybe 5K runners, those kind of people would do, middle distance runners, 5K, maybe even 10K runners might do that. And then we had another condition where they ran at a steady pace at the middle of the heavy domain. So, it's a steady sort of training pace that you might do sort of a tempo type run. And that was matched to the intervals on energy expenditure. So it's the same amount of energy expended. And this time we looked at gait changes. We looked at quite a lot of biomechanical changes. And we found there were some, not many, but some, certainly in the interval training session there were. And most of them, instead of where people look side on at a runner, what we were finding was side on wasn't showing very much in the way of change, but front on, we were getting increases in hip adduction. So the foot's landing more and more towards the middle of the body. So they're unable to, as they fatigue, they're unable to control that movement that rotation. That was less obvious in the steady run. So there was more fatigue, certainly in terms of gait changes being shown. We also measured strength using a handheld dynamometer. So we looked at max force people could produce in all sorts of different movements, and we found fairly similar drops in strength, so sort of 10 to 12% drops in strength from the beginning to the end of the session. And that was fairly similar for the run and for the intervals. Yep. The intervals showed a little bit more drop in strength for the hip adduction and hip abduction. And then we followed that up with a further study where we just focused on the interval training. And then we did femoral nerve stimulation. So the femoral nerve is in the groin. And if you electrically stimulate that, you can get the muscle to contract without conscious input. So you can get a differentiation between what the person could do voluntarily and what they can do if you stimulate the whole muscle to contract using the electrical stimulation. We did that and we found some kind of central fatigue at the end of the training session. So central fatigue is it's somewhere in the nervous system from the brain down to getting the muscle to activate. So there was some fatigue there, but it didn't explain all of the fatigue that was occurring at the muscle level. So there was some fatigue occurring in the muscle as well. So there's both central and peripheral fatigue at the end of that training session. But we also had those runners come back the following day and just to do a steady run. So we did a steady run before, after the interval training, just for 6 minutes. And again, the following day. So we had a standardized speed they ran at 3 times. And we found changes in gait after the interval training session. And some of those changes in gait were still evident the next day. And so were some of the drops in force. But in most people, the central fatigue had gone, but there was still some muscle fatigue evident. And so, and some people were demonstrating this change in gait, which we thought was quite critical. So that's my kind of background in some of the kind of relevant running research that we've done. And in addition to being an academic, I'm a coach. I'm a level 4 athletics coach. I coach mainly from 800 meters up to probably 10K. I have done a couple of people running marathons. I'm a time coach to triathlete, but mostly it's kind of middle distance, cross country, some road runners. And I do that at my local kind of community club here in sort of Newcastle. I've coached at various levels from club level up to, age group internationals.
Awesome. I think we want to touch on a number of those different topics, especially because I think we talked about this on the day, actually. I think someone put a hand up and asked about with all the research that you've done and are doing, how is that applicable to the coaches on the ground working with the athletes? And obviously you are somewhat unique in the fact that you're doing both, which is, is amazing. So, I know, and I think you said you've been doing it for, decades plus, I think. So, in terms of working with athletes and on the ground and stuff. So, be cool to unpack that. But fatigue, this fatigue resistance, could you unpack this a little bit more, in terms of to define it a little bit more, and in terms of because this is obviously what I lean into. I was resonating the most with, because as a coach, first and foremost, strength and conditioning coach, working with endurance athletes, runners, cyclists, swimmers, triathletes, ultra distance, middle distance, running economy, running efficiency. Someone always looks good at the beginning with some relatively good coaching, some relatively good self-awareness. At some point, everyone's wheels start to fall off. They all start to kind of, lose technique, lose efficiency, their economy starts to drop. But for us, in terms of injury prevention, compensation, in terms of being assigned to overload certain aspects of their body. A lot of the time for us, with us at Strength for Endurance, is we're identifying their strengths and weaknesses when we first work with them. And lo and behold, some previous injuries lead to these compensations, which then leads to poor running economy later on down the line. But fatigue, I'm very intrigued, because we talk about how important it is to have adequately strong enough hamstrings, adequately strong enough core strength, single leg strength. Your ability to jump and land should be relatively good and confident and competent both sides, because at some point, your body is going to potentially, you're going to lose that. You're going to have that level of fatigue. Again, with all your research, you're going into obviously interval training, you're working with certain body populations and your samples and certain things, but just, can you expand on what fatigue resistance is? I mean, can you define it? And what, because I know that there's a definition I think you presented on the day that.
Yeah, so you get all these changes that take place as athletes fatigue. We get the gait changes, the loss of strength, some of the central fatigue, and all that. And it's really just the ability to minimize those things, essentially. So you've got mechanical fatigue, metabolic fatigue, neuromuscular fatigue, and it's our ability to minimize them, as much as we possibly can. So I think in trying to work out how we develop fatigue resistance, because essentially in the research, it's a relatively new field, but I think as athletes and coaches, we've kind of worked on it for a long time.
Yeah,
we've quite a good handle on it, whereas I think the research has kind of overlooked it quite a lot. But we really need to understand where the fatigue is coming from in order to then be able to address it and put the studies in place. I know of only one study they didn't talk about measuring fatigue resistance, but there was a study where they had 2 groups of 10K runners. One did a resistance training program, one didn't. They all did the same running training program. They ran a 10K before they did anything. And then after the resistance training program, both groups ran another 10K. And there was just a change in the pacing profile. So in the control group did nothing. In both 10K runs, their 10K, they had nice even splits across. In the last sort of 3 or 4K, they slowed down a little bit. And the group that did the resistance training showed that before the resistance training, and afterwards they were able to maintain that pace to the end. So they were quicker. They didn't run faster in terms of the average speed, in terms of meters per second or minutes per mile or however you judge your speed. They just managed to run at that speed for longer. And so overall, they were quicker in their 10K by the end. So they didn't get that drop off with fatigue towards the end. So I guess you would say that was fatigue resistance. And that's pretty much the only thing that I'm aware of out there looking at that. That doesn't mean that it's only resistance training that works. There could be other things that work too. There are studies. There's one where they did a 5K on an indoor track, and then they looked at the pacing profile and people slowed down towards the end. And that change in some of the mechanical things that they measured was related to training volume. The people that did the biggest training volumes showed the smallest changes. But that's not the same as doing an intervention study where you would increase mileage to show that it got rid of that fatigue resistance or enhanced fatigue resistance, got rid of some of the fatigue.
It's been a hard sell for the last decade plus of getting people to do strength and conditioning work alongside their run, bike, swim training, whatever they're doing. And it's the simple way of thinking about it for a lot of people is like, if I get stronger, I can maybe go faster, I can go further. But actually, there's, as you say, like actually having more of a stronger, more stable, more holistically balanced baseline, so you don't have any obvious weaknesses, you're better conditioned across those major muscle groups, so joint structures. Again, it allows for better movement mechanics and for potentially better movement mechanics, but also like better recovery. So it's all those other things that we don't often talk about enough. But actually, like just doing some form of strength training potentially is going to help improve your biomechanics. This is going to help improve the conditioning of the muscle tissues, and which is going to help recovery, etc. And I think it's not such a sexy sell. I don't think, people want to do this stuff and maybe see increase their distances, increase their speed. But actually, consistency is huge. Like if you can improve someone's like as you say, resistance to fatigue, you're not going to see those drop offs more and more and more and more within your interval efforts or your longer efforts. That's what you want, right? Because I just want to say by it.
There's two things in there actually. One is the performance versus training bit, and then the other is consistency. I'll come back to performance and training just to do the consistency bit. But I think consistency is the most underrated value in training. Everybody thinks about all sorts of other stuff, sets, reps, and everything else. But just being able to train week after week, month after month, year after year is massive. It makes such a big difference to how well people perform. And I think we don't think of it as a principle of training. We look at all these other different bits and pieces, but I think as an underlying thing that will improve you, I think it's probably the biggest thing. I think everything else if you've got consistency, you can build everything else on top of that. But if you don't have consistency, you won't ever get to your best performances.
Literally, I try and say it as frequently as possible, but like, I can guarantee results if we can keep you consistently training. And like, because it's just
exactly,
like, you know what I mean? But that's the hardest thing, is to keep someone consistent in this day and age where everyone we work with is jobs, they've got full-time jobs, they're parents, they're probably navigating previous injuries or current injuries or whatever, and like consistency is hard, really hard. But if, as you say, if you can moderate training load, you can build up their training appropriately, you can make sure they don't have any obvious weaknesses. Keep them consistent. Turn up every single week and just get a little bit better or reinforce what you've been doing. You will be better in 6 months, 12 months time.
Yeah.
But it's
absolutely,
people don't experience that consistency. That's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah. And sometimes you have to take a step back, like you said. Maybe they've had previous injuries, and maybe it's going back and addressing some kind of problem they've got that's causing those things to occur frequently. And it's about managing training loads, and sometimes you have to step backwards to then be able to train consistently and keep moving forwards. But I think, that consistency is down to managing training load, I think, ultimately. But it's what you need to do, isn't it? That's the bit that gets the results.
I think I've from a sports science background, when I was doing it 20 years ago, and I've always had this, I've understood that you want to have this, establish this baseline with working with someone where, right, okay, what are we working with? Like physiologically, physically, what do we have to work with here? Do we have enough strength and conditioning across the board to be able to then build a ton of volume on top of it. And obviously, more often than not, we've all got certain things we need to be working on, weaknesses. And more often than not, most middle-aged people have had a few injuries, or they've got a bit of weakness in their hamstrings and glutes because they've probably been sat on their butt in careers or whatever. So when you go back to that research, you're looking at, about hip flexors and the, in terms of that affecting gait, hamstrings. Hamstrings is one of the biggest areas I think we're still not bullying people enough on, like in terms of what that level of conditioning needs to be. Like, what does that true level of athletic potential need to be in those major muscle groups? Because calf issues, Achilles issues, knee issues, tibial stress syndromes, like so many of these things is stemming from a hell of a lot of loading going through those legs, whatever the volumes of intensity are. But like, what are the major muscle groups that are probably going to be supporting that mechanism? Hamstrings, glutes. Like, and if you were to test, and I'm not asking you to you might not have the answer to this, but it's like, how do we test the strength and conditioning of those major muscle groups? Are they adequate enough? And some people are still just working on calf raises, and you're like, no, like your calves are strong enough. Like, yeah. But elsewhere, my goodness, you have nothing to give. Like, you have no capacity whatsoever. And for us, some of the biggest results we've had is actually not helping someone with their calf issues. It's been developing their posterior chain or their jumping ability, and that's helped manage that load, that stress. So yeah, I'm just sort of speaking openly about that thing when you kind of the hamstring and thing, the relationship there, because I think that's when you look at the runner, no matter what distance, I would always question the depth of conditioning they have in those key major muscle groups.
Yeah, I think you said a really good thing there, because you were saying there about having the conditioning to be able to cope with the training volume. And I think that's what it comes down to, isn't it? Because, the more you do, the more impacts you have to absorb. And so you have to be sufficiently well conditioned to be able to do that. There's a model of, the injuries that the runners sustain are overuse injuries, or endurance athletes, I guess, are going to be overuse injuries. And there's a really nice model. It's by a Danish group, and the paper's by Bertelsen. And they look at they've got the model that proposes how overuse injuries occur. And so you have this certain level of capability at the start of any training session. And then you look at the demands of the training session. So it's the number of foot contacts and the intensity of those foot contacts. So it's all about the mechanical loading on the muscle. And if that exceeds your capacity at the start of the session, or goes close to that capacity, then at that point, that's when the overuse injuries occur. But your capacity at the start of the session is determined by how well you've recovered from what you've done before. And that can be influenced by the type of recovery methods that you use, whether you've had easy days or rest days, your level of conditioning. There's all sorts of things that feed into that part of the recovery. So it's quite a nice model in the sense that, is thinking about, what am I coming into this session with? What have I got? How much can I cope with? Yep. And then that recovery process, what can I do to enhance it? How can I increase that capacity to tolerate impact forces? And that will come down to things like your strength and conditioning and other stuff as well. And so it all kind of fits together, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And some of that stuff that we did with the 600-800 meter runners. If we take knee pain, so in Shaveen's PhD, we focused a little bit on knee pain. So patellofemoral tendon syndrome. If you look at the people that have that kind of syndrome, the frequent front of knee pain, then they have a certain biomechanical profile when they, or generally they have a sort of profile with lots of that hip abduction. So the foot lands in close to the middle of the body. And generally they're quite weak on the glute med, which is the bit on the outside of the hip. And so that muscle's weak. And so they end up with that kind of the foot coming in, because after a while, the glute med is acting as a brake. So as your hips rotate, as you swing one leg forward, then your foot begins to come in. If you think of it, if you look from above, you look at the hips are kind of doing that each time, aren't they?
Yes.
As they kind of rotate and you're swinging the leg through. If you can't stop the leg from coming inwards, then you're going to get that drift towards the middle. And so the glute med acts as a brake to slow the foot from coming into the middle. Yep. And if it fatigues, then you just get that increased. And then everything else stretches from there. That's because the foot lands nearer to the middle. That puts more of a stretch on the IT band and more of a stretch in the patellar tendon. And they're the bits that we often get, the bits that become sore.
Inflamed.
And so the stuff that Shaveen did with the 600-800s, we found, a drop in strength in the glute med or the hip adductors. And then we also found, that increase in movement, range of movement. So the foot's landing much more towards the middle of the stance. And so as people fatigued, they were beginning to move more towards that sort of knee pain profile, if you like. And 24 hours later, quite a few of those people still hadn't recovered. So that would suggest, that injury risk has gone up by the end of the session, your risk has gone up. And the next day, people are still at risk, or some people are still at risk because they haven't recovered. And so that managing the workload and that recovery become really, really important.
Training load management, appropriate amount of recovery, rest periods,
strengthen those muscle groups so they can act as a brake. Because the hamstring thing is again, it's the same principle. If you think of the hamstrings as knee flexors, they're trying to resist the legs strengthening as you run. During the swing phase, your foot's swinging forward. You have to break that before it lands because it doesn't keep straightening out, does it? And so they're repeatedly being stretched, and it's that ability to resist the stretch repeatedly that is the key to being able to break. And it's the same with that glute med. But the braking action is breaking things from slowing things down from moving into the middle. It's having that kind of level of conditioning to be able to tolerate that, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it depends on, how far are you running and how fast are you running to how much of that braking you have to do.
What current levels of fitness do you have, and what are your thresholds? I mean, this is the best and the worst thing about endurance sport, whether it's running, riding, swimming, you can just keep going. You just, adjust your biomechanics. You can start to run worse and worse, but it doesn't stop you. We know this, all of us have done it. We've all run well beyond our, I don't know how to define it, our biomechanical level of efficiency. We've gone from looking biomechanically sound, nice and efficient, running economically, to then suddenly running I often say a bag of porridge. You've just collapsed everywhere. You're literally just shuffling along. We're all guilty of doing it at times, but that is inviting all injuries of any type, of any sort. And how do you fix that? And this is probably where my biggest bugbear is. People still are trying to spot fix this type of biomechanical flaw, and you're like, right, I'm going to work on my glute med, then I'm going to do some whatever sideline leg raises or whatever, and you're like, no, the body doesn't work that way. It wants to you've got to develop the whole chassis, develop the whole body. What's going to help that person? Well, let's single leg work. Let's work on some plyometric work. Let's do some heavy heavy compound bilateral work to develop the whole kinetic chain, whole posterior chain kind of thing. And it's just, they don't, but you're articulating it so well here, obviously, because you're living and breathing it, but it's the hamstring. What happens if that hamstring lacks conditioning, lacks capacity, maybe someone's come off the back of a hamstring tear or whatever, and then they haven't fully rehabilitated it, but they're still running. They get back to running, but it doesn't have as much function as it potentially used to have. This is a common narrative that we face a lot. And so we go, right, hamstring strength, we need a hell of a lot more in that left because you've torn it way back when or whatever. If we don't get that on top of that, we're going to hit some threshold at some point where you're going to be biomechanically going to start to fall apart, or we're going to start to overload other areas. As I said, your research is kind of, it's a good way of, as I said, that's why I was excited, because it helps to support this narrative, how important it is to develop these other major muscle groups.
Yeah, so I would agree. I think that kind of level of hamstring conditioning is important. I particularly, some eccentric stuff on the hamstrings. I like the idea of heavy compound lifts. I'm a big fan of doing some of that. There's lots of stuff on running economy that shows resistance training improves running economy. In fact, it's more effective at improving running economy than running. Most of the interventions that show that, at least, and of the studies that have done resistance training and improved running economy, then heavy lifting seems to be more effective. Plyometric stuff does work too, but heavy lifting is really effective. So I like the big compound lifts. I like to squat. I like to deadlift. I think they're really good for like you say, getting a big solid foundation that you can then build off. So winter stuff, we would, from all the way through the autumn, we'll be doing big heavy compound lifts. I think
whenever I always want to caveat this a little bit because I don't want people, there's a progression to everything, right? Isn't there? As we talk about this, is I know you at the club level, you're bringing up and it's we had this conversation at the conference where I talk about how you progress people through the ranks of getting to that place where they can lift heavy to a certain degree, whatever that percentage is but it's to get stronger with these, your mechanics. It's well, let's start body weight. What sort of body weight strength do you have? Can you engage those muscle groups? Can you loading your hamstrings eccentrically with just body weight is insanely difficult. I don't know if you've ever done like Nordic hamstring curls and things, like the hardest body weight exercise, like, but too much, if I'm honest, like single leg hamstring bridge. I know Richard Blagrove, who you're very well you're good friends with, but he talks about this single leg hamstring bridge with a metronome beat. I think we've used that as a standard measure of strength and conditioning. Now we expect 20 to 25 reps with that metronome beat to full extension of the hip from left down right side for most of our people that we work with, because of we just needed to set a bar for everyone to be working towards with body weight.
I think that's definitely. I think you can do loads and loads of stuff with body weight. I think that's the challenge for lots of people, is they don't necessarily have access to facilities, but you don't necessarily need it. I think those single leg hamstring bridges we do Nordics. We've done isometric Nordics actually, because I found a lot of them couldn't hold, the young athletes couldn't hold the movement all the way down. No. And so we would just go to the limit of what they could do and then hold that and do that isometrically. And that worked really well in the beginning stages for lots of people that hadn't done S&C before.
Absolutely. I think Nordics is one of those ones that is right up there with like whatever, like handstand holds or something. Like it's right up there with like the complexity and the intensity of that. You don't want to be throwing that around. It's like 1 to 3 reps or even like a 5-second isometric hold or something, because it's just so potent. We find people load their lower back quickly because they just don't have that capacity in their hamstrings. They put it into their calf or their lower back. Going back to your presentation, completely it was very, I can't remember what it's called. It was something, energy systems aren't enough. I think it was something along those lines, because obviously, and it was straight away, obviously that aroused curiosity on the day. But this conversation around, obviously, a lot of this is me speaking, but right now, but it's a lot of the education, a lot of the certification right now is based around us obviously developing an athlete's VO2, lactate threshold, like working their energy systems. We have to do that. We have to be doing that with our individual we're working with. Obviously, what I'm always been about and always trying to champion is the importance of the other side of the coin is that body adequately strong enough to do that. When you talk about the energy systems, you talked about these exercise domains, and I found that really interesting. Could you kind of briefly expound on that, which is obviously impossible because it's a big topic, but...
Yeah, so the exercise domains are really zones of intensity, and this is different from the training zones that you get on your Strava and your Garmin and whatever else. I mean, it may be similar to some of them because there's so many different versions of it. But they're zones of exercise intensity where you get essentially the same or a very similar response. And the different domains each give different types of response. So we have essentially 4 domains. We have the moderate domain, the heavy domain, the severe domain, and the extreme domain. And the moderate domain is where we reach steady state. We just work at steady state very, very quickly. We get to steady state within like 2-3 minutes. The heavy domain, it takes a little bit longer to reach steady state. It might take us maybe 10 minutes to reach steady state, but then we reach steady state and we're able to maintain that. And in the heavy domain, you might last anything between 3 hours, maybe down to as little as perhaps 40 minutes, something in that kind of band. And then we go above that into the severe domain. And this is where things start to change quite a lot, because at this point, we now start to get anaerobic energy contributing significantly to our performance. So when we're at steady state in the other 2 domains, steady state essentially means that the aerobic system is supplying all of the energy that we need. And so now we're going into non-steady state exercise. So the aerobic system can't work fast enough to produce the energy. So the shortfall between what you need and what the aerobic system can supply is met by the anaerobic system. So there isn't a switching from aerobic to anaerobic. The anaerobic is just beginning to come in and make up that shortfall. And so the faster you run above that maximum steady state, then the more the contribution you'll need from the anaerobic system. And then that severe domain ends at max aerobic speed, so VO2 max. And then above that is the extreme domain, which is probably more like the 800, 1500 meter runners, but certainly the 800 meter runners. So the moderate domain, really, we're probably looking at marathon runners. The world class, the elite marathon runners would probably be into the heavy domain. And the heavy domain would be half marathon, 10-mile marathon, 10Ks, those kind of things. And then when we get into the severe domain, we're looking more at 5K, 3K, 1500, those kind of events.
You mentioned about two athletes having the same VO2, the same lactate threshold, but one could produce very different results to the other, and it was based around their kind of running economy and these other factors. again, going back to this whole, these other factors that make up, so we know we're not dispelling the importance of obviously having to train any energy systems, but it's this wider view. And actually, like, if you want this total performance view, it's like understanding all the variables. And if you only focus on just the hard work or just on the kind of aerobic, anaerobic training, you're still missing pieces of the puzzle. And it's going back to the other factors, which it would be fair to say that's running economy and fatigue resistance.
Yeah, so I kind of, when I teach my students, I talk about the big three, and traditionally these are the things that we've looked at: VO2 max, maximum steady state, which comes under loads of different names,
yes.
Whether it's OBLA, anaerobic threshold, critical speed, critical power, or whatever you call it. Essentially, it's the same thing. It's the point where you can no longer work exclusively aerobically. So we have VO2 max, the max steady state, and then running economy. So VO2 max and maximum steady state are essentially metabolic measures, and running is how much energy we can produce, or the rate of energy we can sustain for the duration of the task that we're doing. And running economy is our ability to translate that amount of energy into movement. So different people will have different abilities to translate that. So yeah, you could have people that have the same VO2 max and the same maximum steady state, but they, due to their movement efficiency or how they convert the energy into movement, they would have different levels of performance.
Yeah. I mean, when we kind of break it down, it's why I think there's so much comparison within training. We all do it. We're all guilty of doing it. Like I feel like I'm in the same ballpark as this person. I've got similar numbers, but yet they're not taking into consideration all the other characteristics: their level of training experience, their muscle maturity, the injuries that potentially they've had prior to this in comparison. But again, it's all the things that we kind of find ourselves kind of repeating or like bringing up. Here to kind of constantly remind someone about. I want the fatigue resistance, some of those qualities. There's a really good slide, guys, that I want to share. I think I shared it on social media once or twice, but I think one of your last slides it just literally showed these pathways, just trying to find it now, the determinants of endurance running. And on one side, you had VO2, maximal metabolic steady state, coming down into kind of sustainable rate of aerobic ATP production, all the way down to average body pace. We've got running economy. Then on the right-hand side of this model, it had this fatigue resistance, and then some of the leading contributing factors that make up that fatigue resistance. Would you mind going into some of those contributing factors, like in terms of like force absorption, fiber recruitment? Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's difficult to know quite how everything packs together because we don't really have enough evidence to focus on. So, the evidence we do have has been about being able to tolerate these repeated stretches. So there's the whole host of different studies that have measured people before and after 5Ks, 10Ks, marathons. And that ability to absorb force, it seems to be a critical factor. Now, whether that's a strength and conditioning thing, it could be a tendon thing, it could be a muscular force thing, it could be, a metabolic thing even, perhaps for some people. So I think there's a lot of individual variation here. And that's what we haven't really investigated. But certainly the ability to absorb repeated impact seems to be a big factor. And that's where that kind of braking action, be it the hamstrings, be it the glute medius, I think that is part and parcel of that. So that loss of ability to tolerate those stretch shortening cycles that we get when we run, I think is part of that. But then also we lose our ability to produce force. So we've seen in numerous studies, including some of the stuff we've done, that if you measure someone's force production before and after a run of some description, a hard training session or a race of some distance, we get a drop in the ability to produce force. And so that will come from some central factors, so the ability to send the signal from the brain down to the muscle, and also some factors within the muscle in terms of its ability to produce force. And again, that will vary to some extent from person to person as well.
Yeah, I know it's never fair to ask these types of questions because obviously there's so many variables, to consider. And I think you talked about on the day about the differences in sex, males versus females. And obviously, we're talking about, again, someone's level of experience, someone's level of consistency, like how honestly, how long have they been training for consistently for without injury, without kind of big layoffs. And there are so many different factors, but that force production, like I'm, again, from a S&C point of view, in terms of wanting everyone that you work with to be able to do whatever they want, but like if they want to go super long, and obviously we're talking about a lot of this research is around middle distance, isn't it? Like it's not going beyond half or marathon.
Marathon tops, yeah. I mean, there is some stuff out there, and there's quite a lot of stuff actually on ultra distance, but I'm not really familiar with that. Just because of the nature of the people that I work with. I've not worked with anyone who's run more than the marathons, so I've tended not to read that. And I think ultra distance stuff is different as well because the courses tend to vary so much more, and the terrain varies, and that then impacts on what's causing the fatigue. So there are factors that aren't involved really in the road races and the track races and stuff like that. So I think it's a little bit more complex in some ways in that, particularly if you've got, lots of changes in altitude, and you're going up and you're going down, then obviously the down, you're getting much more eccentric loading. And you probably don't get that to, even if you run a marathon, although you get lots of foot strikes, you're probably not getting something that's as got as much descending in total distance. And so that makes a big difference too in terms of what you can tolerate.
Yeah, and we've seen such an epidemic rise in trail running and ultra distance. I mean, in the short time I've been in this career, like almost 15, 20 years now, it's like you've got to witness the rise in it. And as you say, like the variety of distances, terrains, climates, all of it, it's so varied now. But that force reduction, we're all getting older. We're all down regulating in hormones. We're all losing muscle tissue. Our recovery rates are diminishing. Like, but that is a sad fact of aging. And it's like, not sound too drum, but it is a fact. I add to a sad, but it's how do we resist that? How do we kind of resist that? And it's, well, I've always put the question to who we work with is like, are we training for that? Or what are we doing to prevent that? Like to make sure we're maintaining muscle tissue, building muscle tissue. Like, are we actually training our abilities to produce force and absorb force, like jump and land? And this is what we can go into this actually. Like, I don't know how you train your athletes as a coach, but like just instigating like where they're developing some form of like jumping on a week to week basis where they're like, because it's amazing. Someone can run track, can run high volumes of running across the week, but yet you ask them to like do a couple of broad jumps or a couple of standing single leg hops. And you suddenly see so much an overwhelm, almost like a level of anxiety that you just sometimes you don't expect. You're like, oh, wow, okay, this is interesting. But it also tells you a lot about that individual's athletic abilities. If they can constantly jump on their right leg, but then suddenly their left leg, they've got nothing to give, or there's massive instability. And then there's an interesting correlation with left side injuries or left side imbalances. It's like, okay, well, I mean, in terms of force reduction, force absorption, like, have you tested for that yet? I mean, I know you're doing isokinetic strength testing, but have you looked at plyometric kind of training as such within?
No, I mean, I've got some ideas for studies that I want to do, and within that, as the fatigue resistance, we don't really have a test for it. In terms of what are we trying to measure. It's such a new sort of idea that people haven't looked at it. Yeah. So there's some things that I'm interested in playing around with, and one would be like a repeated jump test as a measure of fatigue resistance. But I mean, that's a little way down the line. I mean, there's a few studies to do in order to look at that. I
was literally going to put you on. Well, the only thing I was going to put you on the spot today was I was thinking like if he could have unlimited resources and he had a sample size of whatever he wanted, like what studies would he in the future do? Because obviously your mind must run away with you at times and go, right, if if you could and you had the right sample, if you had as many subjects as you needed, and of whatever age you wanted and whatever sexes you had, and then whatever facilities and time frame you had, what would you do?
How long have you got?
But plyometrics, I would, counter movement jumps, and they are kind of one of a standard test to kind of test power and things. And it's, I don't know, like, would you get them doing interval sets, like test their power at the beginning of, and then get them doing some form of interval training and then testing it midway and then at the end?
Yeah, I think we're not there yet, but I think it's coming, and probably fairly soon. I think wearable technology is going to impact enormously on what we know. And as a researcher in the lab, it's hard to get people in. It's hard to, we have real trouble recruiting enough people to come in, and it takes a lot of time for them to come in and do stuff. And sometimes these measures are quite slow. Doing the gait stuff, for example, to put all the markers on somebody and get them on the treadmill and running, it's quite a long session. Whereas the wearable tech, they just put it on, they just go and live their normal life kind of thing. And I think it also means we can get more data. We can start to get big data sets and see more. There's so many studies where they've used 6, 10, 12 people, and then we're generalizing our findings from that. And I think that's a real limitation for us, because it's not very many people on which to base the knowledge. And suddenly, starting to have hundreds of people, it starts to change what we know and what we can find. So, I think the opportunities coming up in terms of big data sets and finding stuff out, I think is quite exciting.
I mean, I've always lent into that, because I've always said, like, if you start a training program with anyone, like, you want to know what you're starting with, and because you can then move forward with it and go, right, am I seeing results? Am I seeing improvements? So we've always kind of basically screened everyone we work with, right? Look at their movement mechanics, just test their basic ability to jump, land. We film it all, so they'll film it all. How strong their single leg strength is, hamstring strength, calf strength is. Look at their run mechanics, but just not so much to pick it apart. It's more just like, go, right, that's your baseline. That's kind of what we're working with. That's your movement competency, and then let's go. Let's start training. Let's start building on it. And as a coach, you spend half your time motivating people and creating and sort of keeping moving. But if they can start to see the differences in their performance, it's like in that kind of internal kind of motivation starts to build. But it's much different for you, I guess, because for us, because we look at hamstring strength, single leg strength, core strength, we look at those so many of those things with everyone we work with. I can sort of stand here and go confidently say most runners we work with don't have adequate hamstring strength, don't have good single leg strength, probably don't produce enough force and aren't confident enough absorbing force. But I say that because I get to see it every day, but I can say that quite loosely, because I'm not having to maintain the standards that you are in terms of but I kind
of live a double life, because as a coach at a community club, as a coach at a community club, you don't have access to those facilities that you have at work. So you are dealing with what everyone else is dealing with. And so we do a gym session some of them do 2 gym sessions a week, some do 1. It depends on availability and things. But one of the gym sessions is just a school sports hall, and we have the wooden benches, and we've got a few resistance bands, and that's it. And so you do your single leg hamstring bridges. We do like a drop and stick off one of those little sort of benches. We jump onto the bench, and land, and you do them single leg, you do them double leg, and you just get to watch how people move, and you start to go, yeah, you need a little bit more of this, and you can't do that bit, and and so you just have all sorts of things, don't you? Like you say, and I probably don't screen mine in the way that you do, but at the same time, as I'm watching them do it, I'm kind of making mental notes of, okay, this person needs whatever, and just trying to encourage them to do maybe another session of that during the week, perhaps. Yeah, so I would say yes. I think probably foot and ankle is really poor in lots of runners. I think that's a kind of we think about doing glutes and hamstrings and all sorts of stuff, but foot stability and ankle stability, I think in lots of people is poor. Just get them to drop, they have bench is maybe 20 centimeters, and they just step off and drop and land, and they got to hold that. And the number of people that either can't balance and hold that, or they have to kind of get more knee flexion because they can't generate the stability to stay there. Just really simple things that people can't do.
But it's that repeatable skill that you're trying to train, right? Isn't it? Like you're
absolutely.
You're working with 16, 15-year-olds, or you're working with 30, 40-year-olds, or you're working with 50, 60-year-olds. Like every population potentially could struggle with that basic proprioception, balance, coordination. But again, it doesn't make any sense if you want to run trails, you want to run track, you want to run hard, you want to run long. Like, what's the first point of contact, as you say, foot and ankle? Like your ability to produce force through the ground relentlessly, consistently. Like, how are you going to do that? It's not even run mechanics. Like, you can be told till you're blue in the face what the best running mechanics are for you. If you don't have that capacity, the depth of conditioning to maintain it. And this is what, again, I go crazy with a little bit with all this run gait analysis stuff that's going on. It's like, please tell me you're supporting that individual with all that information you're giving them about best biomechanics they can have, with a comprehensive program that's going to help them build that. Like, as you say, it starts with jumping off a bench or doing some hamstring bridges, but please, where you're supporting that, Well,
that's it, isn't it? The question isn't, you need to change your gait to this. It's why isn't your gait that? Because, we're pre-programmed to run, aren't we? That's how we've evolved.
Yeah.
And so we must have some model in our brain of what it means to run. Now, why can't you run like that? Is it your habitual movement pattern? Is it that you've got muscle imbalances? Is it that you're not strong enough? Is it you can't recruit the muscle fibers? You know, so in some ways, telling someone, oh yeah, okay, I want you to do this to your running mechanics. First of all, you've got to know whether they're capable of doing that.
I want you to run more on your forefoot. I want you to run with more hip extension. I want you to run with more whatever. And you're like, oh, that's great. But after 1K of running, they've got nothing to give, and they're just going to be, they're going to be collapsing whether they can afford, they can, whether they can or not, or want to or not. And it's, as you say, do they have that conditioning in place in the first place? Do they have that skill set? You're working with a 16-year-old that's suddenly gone through a growth spurt. Watch that person land and jump again. They're all arms and limbs. Like it's a normal thing to see. But what are you doing to help that individual develop those skill sets? Like, and as you say, like, I mean, you're doing exactly it's exactly what they need to be doing. Drop jumps or depth jumps when you're coming off a bench, down landing onto that single leg. That working on that ground contact in the ground, working on those landing forces. It tells you everything about someone sometimes. Like literally, you can just watch that and go, "Ooh, okay, this could be interesting to watch them run gait after this." Yeah. So with your on the coaching level, this is a really good question. After your lecture, I think one of the coaches in the room put his hand up and said, "So you as a coach, what with all this knowledge and science and research that you have in your head, how do you apply it on the ground level?" Because I think we talked about this off the mic, in terms of this not disparity, but like this gap at the moment where you've got lots of research promoting it, or talk about the benefits and the pros, but then actually trackside or out on the trails or whatever, like how can we get people doing it more, or coaches implementing it more on a basic level? And you're doing it in a sports hall. Are you prescribing? Are you helping people with the more, like developing more heavy lifting, heavy loads?
Yeah, so I've got a group of about a dozen people, and everybody comes and does the Tuesday night indoor session. But the minute we're working, so the first kind of 4 6 weeks, it's kind of everybody doing some real basic stuff. And it is foot and ankle, it's some trunk stability, it's hip stability, a lot of work on hip abduction, adduction. And then gradually, as we go through the winter, then we'll start to change some of that. As people get some of those basic skills in place, then we'll start to increase the load. And then we maybe change the type of exercises. So at the minute, we've got things like ankle eversions, ankle inversions with a resistance band, stuff like that. But once, and the kind of like the drop and the stick, and I might keep some of them in the warm up as we go on, but then we'll go on to a circuit which is more whole body exercises or large body movements, Bulgarian split squats, some press ups, some mountain climbers, or whatever you might be doing, some hopping, some bounding in there. And we often do that in a more Oregon style circuit, if you know what I mean by that. Yeah. So we'll do something like that. So it becomes much more intensive, if you like. But we will keep in some, not all of what we've been doing early on, just as part of the warm up, and
bring up
move it in that direction, really.
Yeah.
But when you've got a lot of people in one space at one time, it's hard to individualize. I mean, I probably could do a little bit of that, perhaps if I was a bit more structured. But one of the problems I have is it's just the space in the kit. It's having enough of everything for everybody. So I try and start off by ticking all the boxes for everybody. Really, give everybody a well-rounded program. And for some of them, I know some of those exercises are going to be dead easy because they can do it till the cows come home. And for other people, they need to work on that. But it's kind of giving them a fundamental level across the board of everything that I think they kind of need. And then we begin to build upon that. Yeah.
You can't and shouldn't bash, like it's exactly what you want to be doing and reinforcing all the time, isn't it? Like you just want, doesn't matter if it's boring, doesn't matter if it's kind of, I mean, sometimes you want to make it entertaining because obviously you want to create some form of energy within it. But a lot of the time it's like, no, just keep doing the basics relentlessly. So, like we touched on it earlier on about the consistency, like who are those that are getting great results still years and years later? They're probably the ones that have literally just been relentless, absolutely relentless in their behaviors.
Yeah.
Warm up, recovery, drills, relentless.
I think it's interesting sometimes when you step outside of endurance sports and look at other sports, and you look at like tennis or golf, and you look at the top players and what they're doing. Although they're the players with the best skill sets, they still probably spend more time than anybody else practicing the basics. And I think there's a lesson there, isn't there, to learn that somehow you can never move away from those things. You still have to be able to do a lot of those things.
I don't know if it's naivety or ignorance or whatever, but like some people have such a romantic connection with running or riding or something that they just literally it's all they do. And you're like, I know you love it. I know that's all you want to do, but like look at any other sport, any other industry, and like sport, and they will. There is a non-negotiables that you just have to keep doing. Like if you want to keep doing what you love doing, again, and I say this enough as well, is there's A, B, C, D, E that you just have to relentlessly keep doing. Like, and they say movement mechanics, movement efficiency, range of motion, like landing ability, like all this stuff is, we're losing it. We're not gaining it. We're not like, gaining it. If we don't train it, we lose it. Right. So it's, what you're doing there is, again, it's replicable in pretty much any environment. You could do that track size with some bands. You split squats from the freestanding position. You could do there's so many things. Single leg RDLs. You could be doing so much of that stuff.
Yeah, that's right. When we came out of COVID, we couldn't get indoors, so we were doing these kind of things through the winter down on the seafront. It's the northeast of England in the middle of winter on the seafront is not the most pleasant place to be, but there we were doing. And there's street furniture there. You can use that for doing all sorts of things: step ups, jump ups, step downs, all sorts of stuff. It doesn't have to be particularly complicated, does it? You can just use those things.
I think I will always lean towards, obviously, how can you make something more individualized? And as I say, because of the way you're watching, observing them, it's like, what is that 1-2 things that person needs to do more so than anyone else in that room? Maybe like, what's the thing that, as you're going through the motions with A, B, C, D, E exercise, all right, Nathan, or all right, Sophie, like these are this is the one thing you need to be like, your numbers need to be much higher, or your efforts or your range of motion needs to be much better. I think that can unlock a lot of people's issues. Like, okay, your hamstring strength is way off, like in a nice possible way. We need those numbers to be right up there, or whatever it needs to be. Like, it doesn't need to be like an overhaul. Like when we screen everything because we want to have multiple data points, like multiple things to kind of see results in over time. But you could, when you're in that kind of environment, you could easily do one or two things that person could go away and work on and come back and work again on something else.
Yeah. I mean, I did this years and years ago. I haven't done it recently, actually, but we have like 5 workstations with different exercises at each one, and they all balance by time, so they do so many seconds of reps. But you could do a circuit of that, and then in time that's left over, you could then say, okay, well, we haven't got time to go round again, but you 3 need to do more of that one, and that one, and you 2 need to do more of that one, and there's ways and means in which you can do it, isn't there?
It's just
as I think of that, I feel guilty that I'm not doing that at the minute. Maybe I should be doing that, or maybe next week I'm going to surprise everybody. And
do you know what the thing is? The more you talk about it, the more it becomes logical. Like, and I think like everyone, how many people we work with who've got previous injuries or other sports they've played that are actually without question contributing factors to why they're struggling. And it's like, cool, like that's obvious. That you can see that you're struggling with this probably because it's linked with that. Cool. That's what we need to, that's one of the main focuses of your strength training in the lead up, or even when you're running. This is probably likely where your biomechanically going to start to fall apart because you on that left side potentially because you're lacking conditioning to that area. And going back to your the mechanics, around the hips, like going back to those major muscle groups. Phil, thank you, mate. I really appreciate your time. I was conscious about taking too much time up. I would happily talk to you all day long about this stuff. But where could people find out more about you and the work you're doing? And
I guess just look at my page on the university website. So just find Northumbria University website and type me in, and you'll come across my page. And my email address is on there. People can contact me through that. I'm not a big one for social media. I am on Twitter, but I very rarely put anything on there. So probably just email is probably the easiest way to get a hold of me.
And more research on fatigue resistance. Where can we find out more about that? So
I've got a PhD student at the minute, and the 6-800s that we did on the treadmill. And the thing about running on the treadmill is your gait's really controlled, whereas when you run outdoors, you tend to vary a little bit. So though you might run your 800s maybe even at the same speed, there'll be fluctuations in pace. And so it's difficult to know whether those ways in which people fatigue indoors are the same as how they fatigue outdoors. So at the minute, we're trying to take that study and take it outdoors, and then start to look at if people do fatigue in the same way outdoors. And then if that's the case, then let's start to put an intervention in place. So we're doing the study at the minute where we're looking at whether we can take the stuff outdoors and whether we get the same results. And then the plan is from there to look at some kind of resistance training intervention to put in place to see if we can rectify some of that or make people more fatigue resistant.
Cool. Intrigued. I'll probably badger you about that at some point. Find out how you're getting on with that.
Yeah, do.
All right, Phil. Thank you, mate. I appreciate it.
No problem at all. Thanks very much for inviting me on. Cheers.